Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps to keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. My name is John Will. I'm 40 years old, and up until a few days ago, I worked as an amateur radio technician and part-time network administrator at a local public broadcasting station in Erie, Pennsylvania. Quiet town, breezy summers, brutal winters, the kind of place where nothing ever happens until it does. My house is tucked on the east side near Lawrence Park. A modest two-bedroom ranch with cedar siding, a half-finished basement, and a backyard that overlooks an overgrown railway line. I lived alone with a shortwave antenna rig that stood taller than the house itself. Most people thought it was an eyesore, but lately it had become my salvation. On the night everything started, I had just gotten home from the station. The Erie Community Broadcasting Building sits on East 6th Street, near the Bayfront Parkway, not far from the old US Steel Mill. We kept a skeleton crew, a producer named Gary, a sound engineer called Melanie, and me. That Thursday night, June 12th, I stayed late to troubleshoot a latency issue in our emergency broadcast system, a bug that had been throwing false test alerts across our digital feeds. The irony didn't hit me until much later. By the time I drove home, it was nearly 11:45 p.m. The roads were quiet, eerily so. No late-night joggers, no cars idling at red lights, no teenagers walking to Sheets for energy drinks. Even the houses seemed darker than usual. I remember driving past a stretch of State Street where the streetlights flickered and then went completely dark. Something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. When I got home, I powered up my amateur rig, an Icon IC7300 connected to a 43-feet vertical antenna, and tuned in to the national 20M tug band. That's when I caught the first whisper of something strange. It was a fragmented signal from a repeater station out of Syracuse. The operator's voice was shaky, half-choked. His transmission interrupted by static, and what I swear sounded like distant screaming. "This is K2 ETR emergency. Quarantine breach. If you're hearing this, turn off your lights. Do not draw attention." Then the signal went dead. I replayed the transmission twice, my hands trembling. It wasn't a pirate broadcast, and it wasn't a prank. I knew the call sign. K2 ETR was a licensed emergency repeater based in Onondaga County. Something real was happening, something very wrong. I tried the national simplex emergency channel 146.5 20M and CH, but it was chaos. Dozens of operators across the tri-state area were shouting over each other. Some were sobbing. One man was frantically trying to contact his wife, repeating her name like a mantra. Others were reporting strange attacks, bizarre behavior, and something they kept calling biters. I switched frequencies looking for clarity, but only found more confusion. Then, at exactly 12:13 a.m., the emergency alert system cut in. My portable NOAA weather radio crackled to life with the signature squelch and tones. Followed by emergency, the President of the United States has issued an immediate shelter-in-place directive. All citizens are advised to remain indoors. Lock all windows and doors. Turn off all exterior lighting. Do not engage with individuals exhibiting violent or erratic behavior. Await further instructions. I didn't sleep that night. Around 1:30 a.m. I killed all lights in the house, drew the blackout curtains, and started assembling an emergency station in the basement. I still didn't fully believe it. I thought maybe it was a terrorist attack or some kind of mass psychosis. But then the power went out citywide at 1:47 a.m. Not a transformer pop, not a blown grid. A clean, coordinated shutdown, like someone somewhere flipped a master switch. I dug out my backup batteries and lit the basement with a single red LED lantern. The solar panels I kept in the garage wouldn't help until morning, so I rationed what I had and prayed the situation would be under control by dawn. But as the hours crawled by, the transmissions grew darker. At 2:18 a.m. I received a call from Melanie at the station. She was whispering, crying softly, and trying not to make noise. Dan, they came into the station. Gary didn't make it. They weren't human. They just kept moving even when the call cut out. I tried to reach her again, but it just rang. I sat there staring at the silent phone, wishing I had told her to go home earlier. I didn't know what else to do, so I listened. There was an operator from Altoona who had barricaded himself in a hunting cabin near Canoe Creek, a retired Navy chief in Cleveland who was giving out tactical advice over encrypted VHF. A terrified teenager in Pittsburgh, live streaming everything he saw until something broke into his house. One voice stuck with me the most, a woman calling from outside Jamestown, New York. Her name was Mara. She was calm, composed, a nurse by trade. She gave regular medical updates and advised anyone with minor wounds to disinfect immediately. She described the symptoms in clinical terms: fever, aggression, a profound loss of cognitive function, followed by violent behavior and a kind of sensory-driven instinct to pursue light and sound. I stayed in contact with her for nearly 2 hours, but her final transmission ended with the sound of shattering glass and a low, guttural growl. That's when I started to believe it wasn't just a panic or a riot. It was something else entirely. By 4:00 a.m., I could hear them. Not on the radio outside. At first, it was a distant clattering, like trash bins tipping over or heavy boots stomping pavement. Then the unmistakable sound of a screen door being ripped from its hinges. I crept upstairs and looked through a small slit in the blackout curtains. There were 4 of them, not soldiers, not looters, just wrong. Their movements were jerky, unnatural. One of them twitched like a broken marionette, neck bent too far, skin blotchy and pale in the glow of a neighbor's motion light. Another one was banging against a parked car, oblivious to the growing dent in the hood. The third one suddenly stopped and turned toward my house. I froze. It had seen the faint glow from my router status LED blinking through the living room window. I killed the power and dropped to the floor. Seconds later, the thing charged at full sprint across my lawn and slammed into the side of the house. The sound was like a body hitting a brick wall, sickening and raw. It groaned, clawed at the siding, and then fell silent. I stayed flat against the carpet, barely breathing. I don't know how long I lay there before I finally crawled back into the basement and shut the door behind me. My heart wouldn't stop hammering. I kept imagining that thing climbing onto the roof or smashing through. The kitchen window, I thought about the broadcast again. Turn off your lights, hide, don't make noise. That wasn't just a suggestion, it was I finally made contact with someone nearby. A voice came through on a local simplex channel. This is Officer Reuben Clark with the Pennsylvania State Police. If anyone in the Erie County area can hear me, we are attempting to regroup at the National Guard Armory on West 23rd Street. Secure location, medical on site. Repeat, West 23rd Armory. I responded immediately. Clark was cautious, but once I confirmed my address and status, he offered me a window just after sunrise before the infected became active again. He used that word, infected. Move quiet, stay low. They don't like daylight, but they can still hear. So I packed. In the half-light before dawn, I loaded a go bag with MREs, a Boeing UV-5R radio, a compact first aid kit, a KBR knife, and an old Springfield XD9 I'd bought years ago but barely used. I chambered around, clipped on 2 mags, and prayed I wouldn't have to use it. The moment the sun broke the horizon, I slipped out the back door, stuck to the tree lines, and began my quiet crawl through the city I once thought I knew. The streets were littered with crashed vehicles, torn open doors, and the occasional spray of something too dark to be dried mud. A flipped school bus lay on its side outside Glenwood Elementary, its emergency exit torn off. I crept past empty houses, some with bloodied handprints smeared across the glass, others silent and untouched. My city was gone. I didn't know it then, but the next 12 hours would test every instinct I had. Every decision would mean the difference between making it to the armory or becoming part of the noise outside. I crossed East Lake Road just after 6:15 a.m. The street was strangely illuminated by the pale morning light reflecting off the bay, casting long shadows that made everything feel off-kilter. A semi-truck had jackknifed into the parking lot of a SA lot, crushing the front of a silver sedan and blocking the entire southbound lane. I moved quickly behind it, using its bulk for cover, careful to keep low and check each intersection before exposing myself. There was no wind, no bird song, just the occasional distant groan or the sound of something heavy collapsing in the distance. The kind of silence that makes your own breath feel like a betrayal. I followed Route 5 westward, past shuttered businesses and the boarded-up windows of what used to be a Dollar General. Someone had spray-painted "infected" inside in red across the side of the building. I didn't stop to look closer. I avoided open ground, cutting through backyards and alleys, keeping my pace slow and deliberate. I kept thinking about what Clark said. Daylight helped. But I'd seen them move during the day, just not as fast. At one point near German Street, I found the remains of what looked like a National Guard checkpoint, sandbags, a burnt-out Humvee, and the twisted remains of what had once been a chain-link barricade. Spent shell casings littered the street along with 2 bloodied M50 gas masks abandoned beside an open duffel bag. I didn't see any bodies. That didn't comfort me. I took one of the masks and clipped it to my pack. I wasn't sure if the infection was airborne or bloodborne, but the operators had worn protection for a reason. I kept moving, following 28th Street as it wound closer to downtown. Near the intersection of Holland and East 26th, I spotted movement through the shattered glass of a law office. I froze, dropped to one knee, and raised the Springfield in a low, ready position. A shape stumbled forward, tattered business attire, a bloody pant leg limping heavily. It moved past the window, oblivious to me, and collapsed stirred. I circled around the block rather than risk the direct route. At 7:30 a.m. I reached the rail underpass that ran near the old General Electric plant. The underpass was narrow, flanked by thick retaining walls smeared with grime and graffiti. I debated taking the longer surface route, but time wasn't on my side, and the direct path offered better concealment. Halfway through the tunnel, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing behind me. Not slow, not dragging, running. I bolted. The sound reverberated through the concrete corridor like gunshots. I didn't look back. I just ran. Boots slapping wet pavement, my backpack bouncing against my spine. As I cleared the far end, I ducked into a rusted service door wedged half open at the back of a derelict storage building. Inside was pitch black and suffocatingly warm. I crouched low, heart pounding in my throat, and listened. The footsteps stopped. A wet, snuffling sound replaced them, followed by a low, throaty clicking, then silence. Whatever it was had passed by without entering. It wasn't intelligent, but it was aware. I waited nearly 10 minutes before pushing open the door and slipping back into the sunlight. My legs felt like rubber. My lungs burned, but I couldn't afford to stop. The armory was still over a mile away. I crossed Parade Street at 8:05 a.m. A plume of smoke rose somewhere near the bayfront, black and oily. I kept my radio on low, scanning for Officer Clark's frequency. Finally, I heard him again, faint but clear. Anyone approaching from the east side, be advised, South Park Row is compromised. Repeat, square is not secure. Alternate approach from Peach or Liberty advised. I thumbed the mic. This is Harrove. I'm coming in from German Street, just past the GE underpass. Should reach Liberty in 20. A pause. Harrove, we copy. I've got eyes on Liberty and 24th. We'll watch for you. Be quick. Avoid any visual signals, no reflective gear, no flashlights. They're keyed to light and movement. I confirmed and shut the radio off. The closer I got to Liberty, the worse the devastation became. Several blocks were blackened with fire damage, buildings gutted, abandoned police cruisers sat sideways across intersections, doors open, lights dead. I passed a small church, St. Joseph's, with broken stained glass and an overturned baptismal font. A priest's body lay motionless in the parking lot, partially covered by a ripped rain poncho. I didn't stop to see if he was breathing. By the time I reached Liberty, my shirt was soaked through, the heat was rising, and the still air made everything feel suspended in a kind of artificial tension. I crept along the side of a post office, keeping my back to the wall, and peeked around the edge of 23rd Street. The armory was visible now. An old World War II era structure with tan brickwork, barred windows, and a fortified entrance. A Humvee with mounted barriers blocked the main gate. Behind it, I could see sandbag imp placements and two soldiers, one aiming binoculars, the other armed with an M4, scanning the street. I keyed the mic again. This is Harrove. I've got eyes on the armory from Liberty and 23rd. Copy, Hargrove, Clark replied. We see you. Move now, not run. Keep hands visible. I stepped into the open and walked steadily across the street. And that's when the screaming started. Not mine, not anyone from the armory. From somewhere to my left, east 23rd. A woman shrieked in agony, her voice echoing down the block. I turned instinctively. There she was, mid-30s, dark hair matted to her head, sprinting barefoot across the pavement with two figures tearing after her. One of them was missing an arm. The other's jaw hung at a crooked angle. Both were fast. Shouted something I couldn't make out. The woman didn't see me. She was focused entirely on the chain-link fence ahead, but her pursuers did. And when she veered south, they turned on me. I didn't wait. I sprinted the last 40 yards, arms pumping, heart slamming against my ribs. The creatures snarled behind me, feet slapping pavement with inhuman speed. I heard gunfire, a short, controlled burst from the M4, and a body dropped just feet behind me. I dove across the sandbags as Clark pulled me in by the collar. The gate slammed shut behind us, reinforced by a steel bar. The second creature shrieked as it hit the barrier, fingers clawing uselessly at the mesh. Another burst dropped it, and the air fell silent again, except for my gasping breath and the ringing in my ears. Clark crouched beside me, his face lined with exhaustion and tension. "Welcome to the armory," he said. You made it, not many have." I didn't speak. I just lay there, feeling the concrete beneath my palms, knowing how close I'd come. Inside, the armory was dimly lit, powered by backup generators humming faintly from a locked maintenance room. About 24 people occupied the main drill hall. Families, individuals, a few wounded. CS lined the walls and tables had been repurposed as triage stations. Medics were working in rotation. They looked as worn out as everyone else. Clark led me to a folding chair near a portable command table and handed me a bottle of tepid water. "We've got rations for 3 days if we stretch. Ammo's tight. Medical's worse. We haven't had contact with Harrisburg since 0400. He introduced me to Lieutenant Elena Foster, a National Guard officer who'd taken charge after the local guard post commander went missing during the first breakout. She was maybe in her early 40s, squared shoulders and sharp eyes, no nonsense. Her uniform was dusty and stained, sleeve
rolled up past her elbows. I gave her everything I knew, what I'd heard on the radio, the failed repeater stations, the last messages from the Syracuse operator, and Mara from Jamestown. She listened carefully, then handed me a map. We're organizing scouting runs. We need radio contact with nearby zones, and if you're half the tech guy, Clark says, we could use your help in the comms room. I told her I'd do whatever they needed because in that moment, surrounded by strangers, sleeping children, and the smell of bleach and gun oil, I realized the truth. The outbreak wasn't just an accident, it wasn't localized, it was organized. That word organized kept echoing in my mind like a scratched record as I studied the map Foster had handed me. It was a standard tactical layout of Erie County and surrounding rural areas marked up with grease pencil notations. Red X's, over-known lost zones, circles around areas with suspected safe houses, thick arrows indicating flow patterns, movements of infected clusters tracked via drone surveillance, roadblock logs, and spotter reports from across the emergency radio channels. She had done her best to keep track of a situation spiraling rapidly out of control, but even in the chaos, patterns had begun to form. The spread wasn't random. The infected weren't just spilling outward in every direction like water from a burst dam. They were migrating like they were being pulled or herded toward heat, population, maybe even power sources. But there were gaps, huge blank swathes of the map where signals had simply vanished. Dead zones, no transmissions, no reports, no signs of life or movement, just silence. This whole stretch right here, Foster said, tapping the map with the end of a dry erase marker. Nothing out of Mill Creek since late yesterday afternoon. No ham signals, no relays, not even static. Same with Green Township. Same with that pay.
Along the 90 near the high, I said aloud before I even realized I was speaking. If it were jamming, we'd at least hear distortion or cycling tones. This is absence. Either the stations were taken offline deliberately, or the people running them stopped transmitting. Foster nodded once. We're leaning toward the second theory, but we still need eyes on it. I looked over at the portable equipment in the comms room they'd set up in the old motor pool office. 2 ham-burst stations, 1 shortwave HF set, a backup diesel generator, and a bank of battered laptops running off a heavily guarded Starlink uplink. Everything was jury-rigged, wires snaking along the walls and taped across the floor, but it worked. And more importantly, it was still talking. We weren't completely alone yet. They gave me access to one of the side offices and set me up with a working rig and a rotating log of active frequencies. I didn't argue. I knew how to make myself useful. And the only thing worse than not knowing what was happening outside was not being useful while it unfolded. By 10:20 a.m. I had re-established contact with a few isolated relay operators to the south. One in Franklin, another outside Melville. Both had similar stories, fast-moving infections, no centralized response. The CDC had gone dark around 3 a.m. and FEMA's National Response Center in D.C. was reportedly overrun by dawn. There were scattered rumors that the president had been moved to Cheyenne Mountain or NORAD, but nothing concrete, no images, no official confirmation, just frightened voices whispering half-truths into open air. At 11 a.m. Clark returned from a recon patrol and dumped a dirt-smudged duffel bag on the table in front of Foster. Inside were 6 burner phones, a small encrypted USB drive, and what looked like a crumpled field journal. Each item had been found on a body near the old fire that belonged to a military recon team. But the strange part, they weren't part of the Guard or any federal group Clark recognized. No insignias, no badges, even the uniforms were off. Dark grey tactical gear with no identifying tags or rank. We think they were contractors, Clark said. But the weird thing is they weren't running, they were watching. One of them had a drone controller still powered up. When we found him, that raised every red flag in my mind. Contractors don't just monitor outbreaks in quiet towns like Erie. If they were here before the first transmissions went out, then someone somewhere had known what was coming and said nothing. Foster flipped through the field journal and found a list of GPS coordinates. Some were crossed out, others circled. One entry dated 2 days before the first reported attack in our county simply read, Zone 7B, no auditory response. Thermal returns consistent with hibernation phase. Hibernation. I didn't like the sound of that. Foster didn't either. We spent the next hour triangulating the coordinates, overlaying them with our own known incident maps. One of them, Zone 7B, was marked over a decommissioned waste treatment facility just outside Wesleyville. That plant had been offline for over 15 years, but the entry implied activity, possibly something that had been stored or grown there. I felt sick thinking about it. At noon, just as I was preparing a data packet to transmit to the Ohio EOC relay, the base fell into sudden silence. Not the quiet of fatigue or rationing or mourning, but a sharpened military kind of stillness. Radios were lowered, people stopped mid-task. Then the word came through. Scouts spotted movement less than half a mile out. A group of 4 infected, moving erratically but deliberately, had emerged near a gas station on West 26th and were heading east.
Rooftop antenna on the armory. Then, like flipping a switch, they charged. The perimeter team scrambled. Orders were shouted. Gunshots cracked off in tight succession, echoing down the block. 2 infected dropped immediately. The third took 7 rounds before collapsing. The fourth, tall, emaciated, moving on a broken ankle, made it within 20 yards before Clark finished it with a close-range slug from a riot shotgun. No one celebrated. No one cheered because it wasn't over. Not even 5 minutes later, a second group appeared, larger, 10 strong. Then more, emerging from side streets, alleyways, crawling from behind parked vehicles and shattered windows. They weren't aimless. They were probing, testing the perimeter, coordinated. And for the first time, I realized that the worst-case scenario wasn't just being surrounded. It was being studied. We held through the assault. The barricades held. But the message was clear. We weren't going to get days, maybe not even hours. We had to leave, not scatter, not run, move with purpose, with coordination and with a plan that extended beyond just surviving the next sunset. Lieutenant Foster moved with practiced urgency. The floor of the drill hall was soon covered in gear piles, fuel rations and printed maps marked in red grease pencil. Orders were issued in low-controlled voices. It wasn't panic, it was precision. I stayed in the comms room through the next 40 minutes, broadcasting staggered bursts on HF and UHF, warning nearby amateur operators and emergency ops centers of our departure, and attempting one last contact with the regional relay in Youngstown. Nothing came back, only more silence, a kind that didn't echo. At 4:25 p.m. I joined Clark's team. We were designated Recon Group Bravo. Our job was to clear the exfiltration route through Liberty Street, establish visual
just outside of city limits, and mark passable lanes for the larger medical and civilian vehicles. Clark briefed the team while checking and rechecking his rifle. He'd switched from the department-issued patrol carbine to a suppressed SIG MCX. Shorter, modular, easier to maneuver in tight spaces. I carried my M1A in a padded sling across my back and a borrowed Glock 17 and a drop holster on my right thigh. The sidearm felt unfamiliar. I'd qualified years ago, but I'd never used one outside a range. Today that didn't matter. At 4:53 p.m., the south garage door opened silently, revealing the battered street beyond. The shadows had already begun to lengthen, and the sky was turning a dull amber behind sheets of high-altitude smoke. We moved out in a column of 4, Clark in front, myself second, then Mitchell and Hayes, both guard volunteers with backgrounds in route clearance and logistics. Each of us carried a radio, Volcantine, trauma gear, and field rations. Nobody said a word. Words felt like luxuries now. We kept low and to the left side of the street, using the debris and parked vehicles as cover. The smell was worse than before, a metallic cloying mixture of fire, spoiled meat and rain-soaked mold. It stuck in the back of your throat. At one point, we passed a school bus, burned to its frame, windows punched out, dried streaks running down its yellow sides like tears. None of us looked inside. Liberty Street was mostly clear until we reached the intersection at 38th. There, half the road had caved into a collapsed sewer line, creating a jagged pit at least 8 feet deep and crawling with debris. Crossing it would be impossible for the heavier medical vehicles. Clark motioned us to spread out cover angles. I climbed the shell of a delivery van for a better vantage and surveyed the alternate routes. East 39th was narrow, choked with debris. West 38th looked better, some parked vehicles but passable. That's when I heard it, a sound low and wet like bone dragging through thick mud. Then another closer. I raised my rifle and scanned to the north. There, at the far end of the block, came 2 figures lurching forward, faster than walking, not quite running. One still wore the tatters of what looked like scrubs, the other a torn windbreaker stained almost black across the front. Their heads twitched as they moved, not side to side, but up as if sensing vibrations in the air. Clark dropped one with a single, suppressed shot. The other ducked behind a mailbox with sudden, jerky movement, then burst forward in a straight line toward Hayes. We yelled, fired together. The thing absorbed 2 rounds before collapsing with a sickening crunch. Hayes stood still for a moment, staring down at it, the breath wheezing from his chest in uneven bursts. "They're adapting," Clark muttered, using cover. "Learning?" I said it before I could stop myself. "Maybe," Clark answered, "but we're not waiting around to see how smart they get. Let's move." We doubled back and took the alternate route through West 38th. As we moved, I marked each passable street on my printed map with a grease pencil and dropped infrared markers behind us. Simple battery-powered strips that emitted faint thermal signals visible through our NVGs or thermal scopes. They wouldn't help the infected, but for our people following in the convoy, they'd be life-saving. We'd cleared the final stretch into the outer limits. Clark called it in, voice tight with fatigue but steady. "Bravo to HQ. Route clear through Liberty and West 38th. Bridges intact. Markers placed. ETA for main convoy." Foster's voice crackled back. "Convoy rolling in 10. Stick to staggered movement, no lights. Repeat, no lights. After 1900, we have confirmed visual contact with 2 aerials near the lake. Unknown origin." That made us pause. "Drones?" Mitchell asked. "Military? No transponders," Foster replied. "If they're ours, they're not talking." We fell back to a small farmhouse on Zimmerly Road, designated as a forward waypoint. The structure had already been cleared by an earlier recon group and was stocked with basic supplies and water. We took up positions in the attic, watching the eastern road through slit vents. The convoy began arriving in small groups. First the recon elements, then the supply trucks, then a cluster of pickups and retrofitted school buses full of civilians. I didn't realize how many of us there were until I saw them all together. Nearly 200 people, tired, sunken-eyed, but alive. Some carried homemade weapons, others clutched pets or bundles of clothing. There were old men, mothers holding infants, teenagers with faces too still. The silence they carried with them was different. It wasn't the silence of trauma. It was the silence of watching something once normal become wrong beyond comprehension. Foster arrived with the last vehicle, a reinforced ambulance retrofitted as a command unit. The vehicle was coated with grime and blood, the roof antenna bent from a low bridge. She stepped out and walked straight to Clark and me. "Drones flew over twice," she said. "They weren't searching, they were scanning. Top-down sweeps, same frequency band as LiDAR. Mapping terrain," I said, "or population density." Foster didn't blink. "Or looking for survey. Ivers specifically like us." Clark kicked a stone into the dirt. "We're not invisible anymore." "No," she replied, "but we're still quiet, which is why we're not using generators after nightfall. No more lights, no cooking fires, no signals, until 0500. "Any word from Edinburgh or Waterford?" I asked. "Not yet. If they're still out there, they're listening." As the last rays of sun faded behind the low hills, the farmhouse and the land around it fell into total blackout. Not a lantern, not a phone screen. Even the comms team wrapped the Starlink terminal in a blackout shroud and powered it down. The only thing you could see were the stars and the cold, blinking dots on the horizon, slowly drifting back toward the lake. I lay awake in the upstairs hallway, rifle across my chest, back against the wall. Through the window, I could see the outline of the old barn where the medical group had huddled with the youngest children. We'd layered hay bales around it to muffle noise and light. Still, I hated how exposed it felt. Somewhere around midnight, the dog started barking. At first, just one or two. A sharp yip quickly silenced, then more, then silence again. Clark and I were on our feet instantly. We didn't use flashlights. We moved by starlight alone, winding between trucks and low hedges. By the time we reached the treine bordering the eastern edge of the property, we saw it. A shape kneeling beside the perimeter road, human, probably male, thin, barefoot, arms stiff at his sides. He didn't move like the others. He wasn't running, wasn't staggering. He was still. Then he stood slowly and turned toward us. The moonlight caught his eyes. They glinted like glass, too clear. His mouth, too still. Not to scream, but to emit a tone, a low, pulsing hum that vibrated across the field. Not loud, not threatening, but unnatural, like sonar. Behind him, two more figures rose from the grass, then four, then more, not rushing, not attacking, just arriving silhouettes, each as still and tall as the first. As if summoned, I raised my rifle, but Clark held my arm. "Don't," he whispered. "They're not attacking." "Then what are they doing?" I whispered back. "They're watching." And we stood there locked in a standoff with the shadows, the stars above us and the earth holding its breath, knowing that this wasn't the end. This was the beginning, because the outbreak wasn't spreading like wildfire anymore. It was marching. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching